Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Ike Pulver. I'm the director of the Saratoga Springs Public Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Saratoga Book Festival online event. Mark Harris in conversation with Audrey Kupferberg, co-sponsored by the library, the Homemade Theater, and the Saratoga Book Festival, and supported by our partners at Northshire Bookstore. We're super glad to have this program here this evening, and I am going to turn it over to get us on the road to the main event to Eric Rudy, who's the general manager at Homemade Theater, to say a few words of welcome as well. So welcome, Eric.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Rudy, as Ike said, the general manager for Homemade Theater here in Saratoga Springs, and we are so happy to be partnering with the Saratoga Public Library and Saratoga Book Festival for this exciting event of Mark Harris and Audrey Kupferberg in conversation. And we are presenting it as part of our interview series, Coming Home to Homemade Theater. I'm hoping that some of you have joined us who have interest in that. If you are unfamiliar with that series, you can find it on our website, along with our recent improv interactive comedy evening that we did, which was very successful, which ties us into this with Mr. Harris's book. And of course, that can also be found on our website, and along with all of our events coming up this summer. And I believe, yes, you can find our website there in the chat. Thank you, Purdy, for doing that. We are also excited to announce that we are partnering with Saratoga Arts on theater camps for kids this summer. And there's information, of course, about that as well. And we really look forward to more opportunities to collaborate with community organizations on projects like this and other projects as well. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen Beal from the Saratoga Book Festival.
Thank you, Eric. And we're really happy to be involved with Homemade Theater. Homemade Theater is a real institution in Saratoga, and under your leadership, it's been growing and doing really interesting work. And on the other side of the pandemic, it will be unbelievably wonderful.
We're trying. Yes,
yes, exactly. So I thought before we begin, and tonight's program is really special, so I'm not going to take too long, just want to remind everybody that Saratoga Book Festival is an organization of local people who really love reading and want to encourage and promote reading to people of all ages and interests through year-round events culminating in what we hope to be an annual book festival. Our first festival is going to be held October 15th through 17th of this year. We'll do everything we need to do from a safety point of view to put on a live event. There may be some virtual components to it for people who may still want to not necessarily be out in public. But I think for many, many authors and for many of us, it'll feel wonderful to have some in-person connection to writers and to be able to get together to talk about great books. So to find out more about the festival and our programming, we encourage you to take a look at our website at saratogabookfestival.org. You can join this mailing list, tell us you want to volunteer, or become a donor or sponsor. The more folks we have supporting us, the more authors we can have at the festival. And we're looking forward to dabble with as many tastes as we can. So there's something for a number of interests. I'd like to talk a little bit of today's wonderful guests. Mike Nichols, acclaimed author and journalist. We're thrilled to have him with us. In Mark Harris, we're thrilled to have you. In Mike Nichols, A Life, author and journalist Mark Harris offer a full-scale biography of the celebrated film director, stage director, and improv comedian. Mark Harris is also the author of Pictures at a Revolution, 5 Movies, and the Birth of the New Hollywood, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and 5 Came Back, a story of Hollywood and the Second World War. He lives in New York City with his husband, Tony Kushner. Joining Mark is Audrey Kupferberg. Audrey's a film historian, lecturer, and appraiser of moving image materials For more than a decade, she's been a film commentator for WAMC Northeast Public Radio. She's a lecturer emeritus from the University of Albany, where she taught film history for 2 decades and was director of film studies. She and her late husband and creative partner, Rob Edelman, lectured together, co-wrote many film and theater-related articles and biographies of Angela Lansbury, John Travolta, and Walter Matthau, as well as Meet the Mertzes, a double biography of I Love Lucy's Vivian Vance and William Frawley. Welcome to you both. I'm going to turn things over to Audrey without further ado to get into this great discussion of Mark's new book. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's nice to have an opportunity to speak to you about this book, Mark. The book is terrific. And before we get to the first question, I'd just like to say that a few decades ago, when film and theater books were coming out quite frequently, my friends and I used to use the word definitive. Is a book definitive? That meant it was really good. And after a while, it became a joke because after all, definitive is an impossibility. So I won't call your book definitive. I will call it a thorough analysis of Mike Nichols' work in film and on stage. And I will say that it's really a fine book that a lot of people around me are currently reading. I have heard from a handful of people, which is a lot for who I'm in touch with in a week's time, and almost all of them are reading your book. So that's quite nice.
Very.
I want to get to the first question now. The promotion on the book stresses that you interviewed 250 people who knew or worked with Nichols. And while that's quite an accomplishment, I think the more significant accomplishment is getting those interviewed to open up and hopefully be honest and detailed. And to get beyond the press release responses, speak frankly. And once you have that information, to be able to contextualize it into the book the way you've done, in order to create that clear picture of Nichols' personality, lifestyle, and work style. So could you comment on your process?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in, who's zoomed in. I did interview a lot of people, about 250 people for the book, and I stopped really mainly because it was time to start writing. Certainly not because I ran out of people who had at one point or another been in Mike Nichols's orbit. You know, he was, as you said, a stage director and a film director simultaneously for 50 years, and a major improv performer for 10 years before that. So the list of people he knew was endless. And of course, they were instrumental in any success I was going to have in recreating and understanding this extraordinary life. So it meant a great deal to me to talk to them, and a lot of the work I did was in tracking them down and finding them and getting them to say yes. And then, yes, as you said, trying to get beyond very familiar and sometimes almost unintentionally over-rehearsed stories that had been told over and over again. You know, it's funny, a lot of people have asked me, how do you know when someone's telling the truth and when someone's lying? And I always want to explain that it's not often a question of lying. Sometimes it's a question of having told the same story so many times that you yourself don't really remember what part of it is real and what part of it is the ornamentation that has attached to it over decades. And that's particularly true when you're talking about something that's very successful. I mean, anyone who is talking about The Graduate, who is answering a question about The Graduate, is probably answering a question that they've been asked before many times. So I always try to find interesting side doors into somebody's memory, something that will just shake them loose from a rehearsed answer and get them to revisit a moment in their lives, often in the very distant past, in a new way. And the other thing, of course, is that this book includes a lot of failures, because any artist's career includes failures, and I think they're as illuminating often as successes. And people are, in an interesting way, better about talking about failure than they are about success. I think partly because they've talked about it less often, and partly because if the failure is distant enough in the past, people have stopped being defensive about it, and what they have to say about why something went wrong is often really interesting and really illuminating. But it's a challenge and a joy to have done these interviews, many of whom were with people who were very advanced in years. I mean, the pool of people I interviewed between 80 and literally 103 was considerable, and it was fascinating to me to listen to them and to encourage them to re-explore their past and their association with Mike.
Well, you're talking about the hits and the failures, and that leads me to a brief remark, a brief anecdote in your book concerning Jean Renoir. And it really hit me hard. Jean Renoir was talking to Mike Nichols, who was really a novice to filmmaking at the time. And he was saying to Nichols, use your expertise with working with actors and working with the story, and leave the technical expertise to the Hollywood experienced people who've led their lives working in cinematography and in various aspects of filmmaking. And the first two films that Nichols made are incredible. They're innovative. They're milestone films. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, followed by The Graduate. And this brings me to my theory. My theory is that Nichols took the advice of Jean Renoir and left the technical, the cinematography to Haskell Wexler in the case of Virginia Woolf, to Robert Surtees in the case of The Graduate. After those two films, Nichols was no longer a novice, and his films take on a very different look, not the monumental look of his first two. And it isn't until he gets late into his career with Wit and with Angels in America that you get the tour de force again. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. I think that Nichols took most of Renoir's advice, but I think the part he didn't take was he didn't just leave it to the professionals. Mike was intensely curious about the technological aspects of movie making. I mean, he wanted to understand camera lenses and in editing, the difference between long takes and short takes, and how things looked in color versus how things looked in black and white, and what a change in lighting within the same room could do for the emotion and the meaning of a scene. He was very curious about all that. So in no sense did he ever say to Haskell Wexler, who shot Virginia Woolf, or to Robert Surtees, who shot The Graduate, or to Sam Osteen, who was his longtime editor. You just take care of all of that, and I'm going to worry about the actors. He did concentrate on the actors, but he was really interested in particularly the parts of movie making that there was no analogy for in theater. I mean, Mike had already directed 4 hits in a row by the time on Broadway or in New York theater by the time he made his first movie. And there are things that are analogous in both media. You're directing actors, you're telling a story, you work with a production designer and a costume designer. But there are also things that are unique to movies. There is no equivalent in theater of the cinematographer or of the editor. And it's always interested me that Mike particularly relied on connecting to his cinematographers and editors, because he knew that was a very, very movie specific skill. And I think you're right that after those 2 first virtuosic movies, he himself became more fluent in some of the technology and the language. He wasn't a novice anymore. But also, I think you see this particularly when he returns to movies in the early 1980s after a long period not making them. When he returns with Silkwood and with all the movies thereafter, he's a little less interested than he was in making every movie a monument, as you said. His movies start to look different. His movies start to feel different because, as a filmmaker, he discovers the thing that he really cares about, which is working with either actors or writers or on material that he really loves and that he feels he can bring something to. So I think what happens is that his art becomes more deeply collaborative as his career goes on, and his directorial touches, which to me are very present in that work, are less overt than they were in his earlier films. But I think even through his 80s movies, when you look at something like Silkwood or Heartburn or Postcards from the Edge, you see the attention to performance detail, you see his interest in surroundings, you see his interest in the physicality of a performance, his interest in social class, his sense of humor, his interest in the dynamic between men and women. I mean, those are all Mike Nichols touches, and they're in all of those movies, but they somehow the movies seem less overtly directorial than his early successes, or even than an early failure like Catch-22.
Yeah. The life of Mike Nichols, the biography of Mike Nichols, includes 4 marriages, drug use. Another author could have taken those aspects of Mike Nichols' life and put together a book that would be not what I'd want to read, frankly, kind of trashy. And you have managed to take the failed marriages and the drug use and put them into a rightful place, but kind of as a background story. And you've put the emphasis on the details of his work style and some of his social life, of course, which melds with his work style. Was that your original mission, or did it kind of come together as you planned the book?
That's a great question. I don't. I think certainly it was his work rather than the details of his personal life that initially drew me to writing the book, but partly because there was a great deal of work, performance work, directing work, theater work, movie work. So I knew that any book that I wrote would really be deeply grounded in exploring that work. I was fascinated by the question of a couple of questions. One was, what are all the different things that a director does? Like, how many different ways are there to direct? Because I think when we talk about movie directors now, as auteurs or as visionaries, we tend to talk about directors who, I mean, the sort of cliche is they have a singular vision and their eye is on that vision all the time, and their job is to overcome anyone who gets in their way, which is basically everyone, and anyone who threatens that vision in order to realize what they want to do. And so when we talk about those directors, we tend to talk about directors whose personal stamp is very strong and very evident from movie to movie. And also there are often directors who write all of their own movies, which is, these days, most of the directors who get nominated for Oscars are directors who are also writers. Mike was not that. He worked with a wide variety of different writers, and he had no desire or ambition to be a writer himself. And his approach as a director, even though he could be very strong-minded and very tough, was essentially collaborative. He was interested in working with actors, with writers, with cinematographers, with stage designers, to realize his vision, but in a collective way. So I knew that that was something I really wanted to explore. And I also knew that he'd been married 4 times. I didn't know a lot about his drug use, but I certainly knew it had happened and that it had affected him. I knew that he had had a breakdown. I knew that he had wrestled with depression, although really in the course of my research, that was something that came to light much more. That was something I really didn't understand when I went into it. And I think that all of that, all of that tumult informed who he was as a person, and it informed his work. So I had no desire to kind of ever sweep the details of his personal life under the rug or anything like that. But I guess the best way I can answer this is to just say I tried to find a balance in terms of explaining what in his life informed his work, what in his work informed his life. And so I'm pleased that you don't think the biography was lurid about stuff that I could have been lurid about. But I'm also pleased that you noticed that it's there and that I didn't just tiptoe over it. He lived an interesting, complicated life, and I wanted the book to be forthright about that.
Yeah. Many of us saw the recent PBS series on Ernest Hemingway. I don't know if you saw it. No, it doesn't matter. It contrasted Hemingway's deep understanding of characters, how he was able to master writing relationships in his books. And yet, as a person, he had real problems mastering his marriages. And I kind of saw a parallel there to Mike Nichols, because really Nichols was a genius at building character and kind of the horse whisperer, to actors to have them understand their characters. And yet he didn't seem to always have successful, important relationships. Like Lillian Hellman, you quote Lillian Hellman, and I thought that was an amazing moment in the book where she's commenting on Nichols living with one woman after another in his house. And she considered it might be a contempt for women that he could have so many women friends, one after the other, living with him. What do you think about this contrast between his real mastery of characters to figuring out his own life?
Uh, well, whatever Lillian Hellman thought, I don't think Mike had contempt for women. I really don't. I think, if anything, his career is distinguished by the fact that, he was born in 1931, and you don't see many male directors of his generation who were as comfortable working with women, starting with Elaine May, of course, but going straight through to Meryl Streep and Emma Thompson and Nora Ephron and the costume designer Anne Roth. Mike liked working with women, and not just having women work for him, but working with them. But I also think that, like a lot of artists, he used his art to try to work out things that he struggled with in his life. He himself said, when he was asked if he thought there was a kind of connective through line with all of his movies, he said, I think that often I seem to be drawn toward stories that are about the problems that men and women have with each other, and it's often centered around a bed. And I don't think I can be much more specific than that. And it's true, he did come back to that over and over and over again. I think he was not afraid of going toward material that might have rubbed up uncomfortably against his own reality. That Mike understood what it was like to be in a bad marriage. He understood what it was like to be unfaithful. He understood what it was like to be in a power struggle with a woman. And he also had this really good sense, and I think this is something that a lot of artists have that's very, very hard for someone like me to write about, because you can't really pin it down. Mike was very good at allowing himself to follow his subconscious. If he knew that he wanted to do something, whether it was an entire project or a scene within a project or create a moment in a performance, it was enough for him that he knew that he wanted to do it. He didn't always have to know why he wanted to do it. He thought he would figure that out eventually, but sometimes he knew enough to say, it's okay that I don't know what's at the root of this instinct. I'm going to go with the instinct. And so Mike had the instinct to tell these challenging stories, often about gender clashes. I don't think he spent a lot of time thinking, well, how is this exactly about my own life? But as he once said, the thing that you decide to do, the movie that you decide to make, the play that you decide to direct, it's always about you. And you always figure out how it's about you eventually. But sometimes it doesn't happen until years after you've made the thing.
This brings me back to Nichols and May. Wonderful collaboration, so important to my early years, because I grew up on Nichols and May. I mean, every time they were on television, we got to stay up late and see them. And my whole idea of sophistication was New York City and Nichols and May and the clubs. Do you think, as I do, that Mike Nichols' work with Elaine May in those early years in Chicago was the best school that he could have had for his future work?
I absolutely think that. And I think that one of the many, many things I did not know or did not understand when I started research for this book, I think that you've hit upon the thing that proved to be the most important to me, which is I always viewed Mike's career as a performer with Elaine May, which lasted from about 1955 to 1962 when their partnership broke up. And then he directed his first thing in 63. I always thought of that as just a really interesting element of his life, like a very uncharacteristic of most directors, prelude to their career. But I don't think I understood until I started reading about it and until I started listening to all of the material that they had done. And of course, until I talked to Elaine May, how deeply connected to the career still to come that work was. I think that Mike learned so much, first of all, about working with a strong woman who he thought was every bit his equal and in many ways his better. He learned so much from working with Elaine May, but he also learned a great deal about directing. It was sort of directorial training for him in that he felt, and a lot of people agreed, that Elaine May, of the two of them, was the more inventive performer. That if you created a character, she could then come up with a dozen things for that character to stay and stay inside the psyche of that character indefinitely. And Mike felt that that was something that he, as a performer, could not do. That wasn't his strongest skill as a performer. So partly to make room for her to do that, and partly because he needed to develop some complementary skills, what he became really good at was moving a scene along, understanding when it was the right time to push them to go from one beat to the next beat, being able to listen to an audience in a live context, whether that was a nightclub in Greenwich Village or a Broadway theater, and know what kind of silence means you're losing them and what kind of silence means they're on the edge of their seat. To know when it was time to end a scene. That kind of thing, an ear for the audience, an ear for when to move on, a sense of pacing, is something that is really important to have in your arsenal as a director. And it's fascinating to me that Mike, who was not in any way the credited director of their work together, nonetheless, I think in some ways began his life as a director before he even realized that that's what he was going to do in that work with Elaine May.
You write about his friendship with Lorne Michaels, and taking that into consideration, and even if they weren't friends, do you consider Nichols and May a precursor to SNL sketch humor?
Well, I do, and I think that Lorne Michaels certainly did. I mean, talking to him was fantastic because he, two of the most famous early things that Mike directed were the Neil Simon plays Barefoot in the Park and The Odd Couple, which were each, 10 or 12 years before Saturday Night Live launched. And those plays, because they read fairly conventionally on paper, and because I couldn't see the productions to know what Mike did with them, I could only interview people. Those plays seem like the kind of humor that Saturday Night Live was rebelling against. So I was really interested to talk to Lorne Michaels and hear him say, because he had seen those productions, no, what Mike did with those plays was revolutionary. The way he directed performers to behave incredibly naturalistically and have moments that almost felt like private moments that you knew from your own life but never got to see on stage. That was what made the plays really work, and that was what made them really special. So I was very interested in the fact that Nichols and Lorne Michaels became friends, because Saturday Night Live arrived at a time when Nichols' career was not in a good place. He had made a bunch of flops in a row in Hollywood. He had left. He was beginning the period where he wouldn't make a movie for 7 or 8 years. He was coming back to New York, trying to figure out what to do with himself. And he was about 44 years old. He was no longer like the hot young commodity. And that's a point in your career when because of that combination of factors, someone could get really defensive and start digging in and start feeling kind of nasty about the generation of comedy that was following him and maybe taking his place. And Nichols did not react that way. He was interested in what was new. He was interested in the next wave of comedy. And I always think that that moment is a real key to understanding Nichols's longevity as a director and as a cultural force, that he did not resent ever what followed him. He was curious about it and interested in it and often appreciative of it and willing to learn from it. And he delighted in it, whether it was Saturday Night Live in the 70s or Whoopi Goldberg, whose career he helped launch in the 80s, or Robin Williams, who he worked with in the 90s and really just revered. He directed him not only in The Birdcage, but in Waiting for Godot at Lincoln Center. Mike stayed open to that. And so Lorne Michaels in turn was very, very appreciative of Mike and almost used him as a mentor in those early years of Saturday Night Live. So that was a part of his life I was very, very eager to explore.
What you describe in Nichols, appreciating humor, styles of humor that came after the Nichols and May, it's so much in contrast to Milton Berle. Remember when Milton Berle started making negative comments about SNL, just because it just made Milton Berle look terrible.
Right.
It made him look very petty and like someone who was completely obsolete, whereas Nichols never had that quality, as you say.
No, I mean the only comedian I ever heard Nichols really publicly disparage was himself. At certain points when people would urge him to reunite with May and keep performing, he would say, "Oh no, I don't want to be this old geezer, trotting out his well-loved routines for the 1,000th time." So he did worry about staying relevant or being seen as outmoded in a way, but never in a way that splashed resentment onto new work.
Well, he didn't allow himself to be typed. I'm looking at his stage work. The man was doing Neil Simon, and he was doing Chekhov, and then he's doing Waiting for Godot. I mean, he was all over the place. He was challenging himself, whereas I think a lot of other Broadway directors kind of get into a niche where they're good at Neil Simon type comedies, so they spend their career doing that kind of comedy direction.
Right. There was a lot of the first 4 hits that Mike had on stage in New York were all comedies, and 2 of them were by Neil Simon, and so and mostly he got very good reviews and he won Tonys and things like that. But there was a backlash, definitely, and the criticism of him was kind of two-pronged. It was really a no-win situation, because there was this group of people who said, well, yeah, these are fun, but it's a shame that all he wants to do is to direct this kind of frothy bourgeois trivia, because he really should be directing Brecht and Ibsen and Beckett and then there was this other group of people who said, well, it's really good that he's directing these frothy little comedies, because that's all he's good at, really. You would never want him to direct Brecht or Ibsen or Pinter, And I think the criticism the one that sunk in a little bit was, you should be directing more serious stuff. So he did have on his list. I mean, there were playwrights he was just not interested in particular directing. I never heard him say he wanted to direct Shakespeare, but he did say for a long time, I want to direct Pinter, I want to direct Chekhov, and I want to direct Beckett. And by the end of his career, he had directed all 3 plus Arthur Miller.
During his lifetime, did you speak with him about doing a book on him?
No, I didn't. I had interviewed him pretty extensively for my first book, which was in part about the making of The Graduate. That was in around, we probably did those interviews around 2004, 2005. It was definitely after Angels in America was finished. And after I finished that book and it came out in 2008, and Mike was very, very nice about it and generous about it, and a wonderful interview. I thought, well, that's it. I mean, I certainly never imagined that I would write about Mike or write about The Graduate again. And it wasn't until after he died, which was in December of 2014, that my publisher came to me and said, "What would you think about the possibility of doing a biography?" Both of my first two books were uh, cultural history narratives with multiple main characters. I had never thought of doing a biography of a single person, but as I started to think about it, I just realized that his life was so interesting that uh, I knew I would never, for a day, be bored by working on it, and it felt like a huge challenge, which is something I try to look for in a book, and um, I just got really interested in the idea of doing it. I thought, you know, if someone is going to do this, and I know someone will, I want it to be me.
Right.
Audrey and Mark, we have a question that kind of ties in with what you were just saying. Mike asked at the beginning of the program, what led you from your books looking at a group of films and directors to a portrait of a single person? So we've sort of covered that, but what were the challenges of each approach?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, my first two books each involved five plot lines. You know, my second book, which is called Five Came Back, is about five different directors during World War II. And my first book is about five movies, the five Best Picture nominees of 1967. But really, it was about the making of those movies, so that story starts in 1963. And in those books, the huge challenge was structural. I think it's a lot to ask of readers that they juggle five plot lines at once. So the challenges were, how do I make this story clear and interesting? How do I help readers keep track of all the characters? How do I start? I mean, do I if I start with three stories, because I think you can juggle three stories, when do I feel okay about bringing in the fourth? Can I find points to bring some of these plot lines together so that I'm getting all of my main characters or some of my main characters in the same room? It was like that, but it was also liberating in a way, because I felt like I've said this, but I felt like an orchestra conductor. Um, with a huge orchestra at my disposal. And when one plot line was sort of going dry, all of a sudden I could say, okay, well, now it's time to bring in the strings, or to bring in the piano, or let's have this be all about the brass. So those challenges were structural. And when I switched to biography for this, I thought, oh my gosh, well, one thing I'll never have to worry about is structure. I'm tied to one life. I knew that I wanted to tell it in chronological order rather than to impose some sort of device on it, because I think chronology is the way you understand a life. But I also knew that there was no one to cut away from, no one to cut away to. There, you were hooked to this one story, this one person, and I realized that because of the time period the book took place over, which is 1931 to 2015, that it spanned everything from something that felt like now to something that felt like history, to from a period where an almost limitless number of people were available to talk to a period where almost no one was available to talk. So so those, the challenges I think were considerable in both forms, and I'm very, very glad I took this one on. I don't consider myself a biographer now necessarily more than a historian, but I definitely consider myself more a biographer than I was one book ago.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, one thing that really sets him apart from other people is his childhood. Mike Nichols had such a childhood filled with misery, with danger and sadness, and losing a parent on top of everything else. Born in 1931 in Berlin. I mean, you don't have to say too much more. He was a Jew. I'll add that to it. And then having taken a medicine that he was allergic to, which resulted in him losing all the hair on his body, which never grew back, and not even being able to have a wig as a young boy, and having to go to school and either be this bald child or wear a hat.
Right. And then his father dies very suddenly when he's just 12 or 13. I mean, there's nothing about Mike's life from birth to 18 that suggests the life to come. I mean, it was the immigrant story, obviously in the 1930s of Jews leaving Europe for America. That's not an uncommon story, but Mike had a couple of added strikes against him, as you point out, and so it's really interesting to me to have considered his life in the context of such a humble and fraught and difficult start.
Yeah. So there's a mystery in your book, the brother, and I wouldn't even bring this up except towards the end of your book, you bring up the brother again at the funeral. You didn't speak with the brother, did you?
I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did.
Tell us about the brother.
Mike has a younger brother named Robert. He's 3 years younger than Mike. So I think that would put him at about 86 now. He and Mike were close as children, but then there was no rift, but they went their separate ways as adults. Mike went into his career, and his brother became a very distinguished physician. He's now retired. And yeah, I did speak with Bob Nichols, who was really very instrumental. Like a lot of the detail you read about Mike's family and Mike's childhood on the Upper West Side of New York, and about Mike's unhappiness is from him. I really couldn't have reconstructed those years without him. But yeah, I mean, I know what you mean by mystery, because I do have him at the very end showing up at this very star-studded memorial service that was really so packed with famous people that when he got up to speak and people didn't recognize him, they were like, oh, who is that? And you know, I remember them all kind of leaning toward the podium as if the presence of Mike's brother was going to unlock some essential mystery about Mike and who he was. And it certainly unlocked a lot for me. I mean, he's a lovely, very thoughtful man, and I'm very grateful to have spoken with him.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad I asked you about that. Solves the mystery. There's an interesting quote from Jerry Adler in your book. Jerry Adler, who was stage manager on several of Nichols' productions and then was an actor as well. He says, quote, he, meaning Nichols, could have been a psychiatrist or a mechanical genius with sets, but he never revealed himself. And do you agree with Adler on that? because I think what you've put together in this book is the big reveal. It's Mike Nichols.
I think everybody who worked with Mike would have a different answer about whether he revealed himself or not. And I think the truth is probably that he revealed aspects of himself at times, or withheld them at times strategically, depending on what he thought would work for the moment. I mean, and I think this again connects to what you talked about in terms of his hair loss. He came to a new country. He didn't speak English at the beginning. He looked different than other kids. So Mike, to function every day, I mean, he once told the actor George Segal, "It takes me 3 hours every day to become Mike Nichols." And he was literally talking about the wig and the eyebrows and all of that, but I think he was also talking about the attempt to create an exterior person and a persona that would get him through the day. And part of that persona was someone who was a little bit opaque, a little bit hard to read, very placid, very calm. He was not a yeller. I mean, he was occasionally a snapper, but he was not someone who would like raise his voice or lose his temper. I think Mike felt it was a necessity from an early age to create someone who was slightly hard for other people to read. Because of course, being easy to read makes you vulnerable, and you don't want to seem vulnerable when you are vulnerable. So I think when I talk to people, and I did talk to them, who basically said versions of, I felt that I never really got to know Mike, or Mike never really showed himself to me, or he didn't reveal anything of himself. I came to think of that as strategic. I think what that meant was that Mike revealed or concealed what he needed to reveal or conceal in order to get through the day and survive.
I'm not quite sure how to express this, but in the case of all three of your books, your writings have helped to keep certain aspects of film history and theater history alive. And I want to thank you for that. I started out as a film archivist, and I was with the American Film Institute for 10 years. I was director of the Yale Film Study Center. Wherever I worked. In fact, I was at Yale when you were graduating from Yale. Wherever I worked, I saw young people. And Mike Nichols' life is something different for me than what it is for all the students, the 20 years I was with UAlbany, all the 20-something-year-olds who are going to be reading this book, my late husband, Rob Edelman, used your first book as a textbook for a course he did on New American Cinema. He was very appreciative of your book. Five Came Back is something that my film friends and I talk about all the time. You really are helping to keep film history alive for generations who are coming along. And I just want to thank you for that.
Well, nothing you could have said would mean more to me. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Do we have any questions from? No. No. Okay. Well, then good. I'll ask some more.
Oh, that's right. We'll let you know.
Well, I do think, I mean, it's interesting here that Steve asked the question that you asked, Audrey, about SNL. And Mike Nichols, like, really, is it his legacy, which you seem to have answered that it certainly plays a role in that. But then he's a lucky son of a gun, because he says, Steve, that he saw Mike Nichols and Elaine May at the Long Wharf do Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
Wow.
Right.
you know, that's sort of the holy grail of Mike and Elaine appearances, because, you know, this was this great thing in 1980. They just sort of miraculously decided that they were going to play George and Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and it was supposed to be a 6-week run at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, and it was actually cut short. It only ran for 3 weeks, because Mike became sick. He got pneumonia, and there was obviously no understudy and no point in going on, and they just had to close the production early. But the people, the handful of people who saw those performances now 41 years ago, have great stories to tell, and it really seems to have been indelible for them. You know, it's just a great shame that it's not preserved, that there's no footage of it.
That's true. Do you have any ideas about your next book?
I have ideas, but unfortunately, ideas are all I have right now. And I think I'm pretty fast to come up with ideas, and quite slow to figure out how those ideas can become stories or narratives. So I'm exploring some things, and as soon as I like, no one will be happier than I will be when it actually turns into something that I think would make a good book. I hope in the next few months I will know what I'm doing.
Uh-huh. One of the books that Rob and I published is on Walter Matthau, and I was very interested in what you had to write about Walter Matthau and Mike Nichols. And of course, I knew that was all true. They had a hard time with each other on The Odd Couple. I always come away when writing a long article, or when writing an actual book, a biography, I always come away with a certain opinion of the subject. And in some cases, I've come away with, well, I don't think I'd want that person for my friend, you know, or I think I've had more than enough time studying that person. Or other times you have great respect and warmth. And I got the feeling with your book that you really have a great respect and warmth for Mike Nichols. Is that so?
I do, yes, and obviously that's colored by the fact that I knew him. He was, you know, at my wedding. He, you know, directed this beautiful thing that is a lasting part of my husband's work. So I can't say that I went in any sense neutral, but I wasn't interested in writing a book that was a Valentine. I really wanted to, you know, do him the honor of exploring his career honestly, which I knew is what he wanted. And what I came away from the work feeling was something that I didn't necessarily have in my head or my heart going in, which is just deep respect for the struggle of any artist who works to refuel themselves and to stay fresh and to stay open to things, open to challenging themselves, open to challenging the people they work with. How do you do that when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and in Mike's case, 80s? What are the differences in the way an artist challenges himself at 40 or 60 or 80? Kind of living with Mike as he went through his life became an incredibly moving thing for me. And I hope if people read the book, they will take away the idea that it's challenging being an artist. It's challenging spending your life trying to make things, and there are lots of different ways of doing it, and he chose a particularly interesting one. I hope they'll come away from it with that, and I hope they'll come away from it feeling that failure won't kill you. it was an important lesson for Mike to learn, he said, when he was in his late 30s and had his first flop, that you could pick up and go on again and not even really be defensive about it. I think that's incredibly important for all artists to know that you can risk falling on your face and that it's part of the job, and another part of your job is picking yourself up and dusting yourself off and figuring out what went wrong, what went wrong because of you, and what went wrong because of fate, and then figuring out what means something to you and how to keep going.
I'll take it a step further. Not only is failure a challenge to an artist, but failure is a challenge to all of us. And whoever reads your book, the reader is keying in, tying in to Mike Nichols' reaction to failure and using it to help themselves. It's kind of maybe not a therapy thing, but they're relating. It's a relationship between the reader and the subject.
I hope that's true. I think it is.
I think, well, it was for me, so I hope it is for other people as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a great discussion. I really appreciate both you, Mark, and you, Audrey, coming tonight. And I wanted to, on behalf of the library, extend our gratitude to both of you and to Ellen and to Eric and our friends at the Homemade Theater. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. And it's really been an insightful discussion. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here's just a little bit more about where you can find more information about the book festival, the library, and Homemade Theater. So our various websites.
Thank you so much, Ike.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. And thank you, Audrey and Mark.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.